Okay, great. So thanks very much. Welcome everybody to the conference on alternative approaches to scientific realism. Welcome to the first talk, more specifically, which will be from Billy Wheeler, who we're very pleased to have joining us virtually from the Vinh University in Hanoi, speaking to us on the question of how realist is informational structural realism. Billy, please take it away.
Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I just realized I was at the end of my talk. Should probably start at the beginning. That's a better place to start. There we go. Yeah, good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me and thank you for allowing me to speak first, given the time difference. That's very handy and very convenient. So the aim of this talk is to assess informational structural realism and to think about whether it provides an attractive alternative form of structural realism, especially as it's been outlined by Luciano Floridi. And what I have in mind is really the thought of a form of structural realism that's appealing for those people who are mainly motivated by Worrellian considerations. So that is trying to find a way of reconciling the no miracle argument with the pessimistic meta-induction. So that's mainly going to be the main question I'm trying to answer. And I should argue that Luciano Floridi's informational structural realism has quite a number of difficulties in trying to reconcile those two arguments. But I think it's quite a good idea trying to frame structure in terms of information and also structural realism more generally in terms of informational concepts. And so I'll finish by trying to give a quick sketch on how I think actually structural realism could be improved by rethinking about it in terms of information, but a slightly different concept of information to the one that Floridi uses in his work. So here's just a very quick overview then of what I will talk about. First, I'll start by briefly going over some well-known motivations for structural realism, just to be clear about the one that I'm going to be focusing on. Then I'll give a short introduction to Floridi's informational structural realism for those who may not have come across it yet or may not know it in much detail. I'll very much try to give a kind of simplified introduction to that so I can just focus on the bits that I think are relevant to the debate that I'm interested in. But we do need to engage with Floridi's wider philosophy. As some of you who have read Floridi's work know, a lot of his ideas are connected to one another, and he presents what you might say a kind of philosophical system. So I think there are some other parts of his philosophy that are quite crucial for understanding his structural realism, in particular his levels of abstraction and his theory of information and his theory of truth. So I'll talk about how those are relevant. And then I'll return to the no miracle argument and pessimistic meta-induction and revisit the question of whether or not informational structural realism is supported by the no miracle argument and whether or not it provides a reasonable defense of realism against the pessimistic meta-induction. And then I'll finally briefly sketch an alternative way that I think you can do that using information. So here are just some three motivations for structural realism that many of you are probably already aware of. This is not all of them. The primary motivation for structural realism, at least within more recent contemporary epistemology or contemporary thinking about scientific realism, comes from John Worrell. And this is an attempt to provide a way of making sense of the no miracle argument whilst also trying to defend realism from the pessimistic meta-induction. So as I'll understand these terms, the no miracle argument is best thought of as a kind of inference to the best explanation, that the truth or approximate truth of our scientific theories is the best explanation for why they are empirically adequate and also why they have novel predictions. And the pessimistic meta-induction is an argument which tries to undermine that by giving examples of scientific theories which have been empirically adequate and have given novel predictions, but have nonetheless turned out to be considered false or wrong in important ways. And structural realism, as it's presented in the work of John Worrell, is an attempt to show how we can still use the no miracle argument to support realism by tracking the continuity or preservation of structure between scientific theories, where he understands structure in terms of the laws and equations in those theories. And this is mostly an epistemological argument because it's focusing on what we can know about the world, and it assumes a more or less strong realist interpretation of things like truth, and knowledge and metaphysics. So on this view, there is a mind-independent external world, and science is trying to describe that world. And on Worrell's view, we can know things about that mind-independent world up to the level of its structure. The question of what amounts to structure is a notoriously controversial one in structural realism, so I'll put that one to one side just for a moment. Another epistemological motivation for structural realism, sometimes called the upward path to structural realism, begins with, as well as consideration, begins with a kind of Lockean view of perception and the idea of an epistemic or skeptical worry that we're somehow stuck behind our perceptions, that we don't perceive the world directly, and science doesn't perceive the world directly, but only through our, in a Kantian sense, we only have access to phenomena, we don't have access to the world in itself. And that motivation for structural realism really tries to think about how we can know something about the world in and of itself behind our perceptions. And that's the view of structural realism most often associated with Russell. But I'm not really going to talk about that one in any detail. And then an earlier version of structural realism, which is also quite prominent still today, especially in the work of people like Stephen French, is a more metaphysical version of structural realism, which tries to make sense of certain quantum physical results that make it difficult to pick out individual particles or individual states of particles and things like that. So this is a more of a metaphysical view of structural realism, but again, I'm not going to talk about that one either. It should be noted that informational structural realism, as Floridi presents it, is an attempt to provide a theory of structural realism that covers all of these. So all of these three motivations are found within his work. And so that's why I think it's important to just raise them here. There have been a few papers already said about the difficulties with trying to use his version of structural realism at an ontological level. And there are also others who have said that it doesn't really provide much a response to kind of Kantian skepticism. So that's why I want to focus on the no-miracle argument and the pessimistic meta-induction. So I think that one's been a little under-discussed. Okay, so what is informational structural realism? It's clearly a form of realism. If we take a look at what Floridi says here, he says informational structural realism is a version of structural realism, and as a form of realism, it's committed to the existence of a mind-independent reality addressed by and constraining our knowledge. Those are quite unusual words, addressed by and constraining our knowledge at the end. That already gives you a clue that this is perhaps no ordinary kind of realism, and indeed, this is a realism with a Kantian flavor. So we'll talk about that Kantianism in a little bit more. And then we get a kind of more or less, this is his more or less polished definition of what informational structural realism is. The way I tend to think of Floridi structural realism is a kind of an alternative way of answering what is structure. So when we say that scientific theories tell us about the structure of the world, what do we mean by structure? You know, how should we interpret that? And the way I see his version is trying to outline that or explain that in informational terms. So here is his more or less polished definition: explanatorily, instrumentally, and predictively successful models, especially but not only those propounded by scientific theories, at a given level of abstraction, in the best circumstances, are increasingly informative about the relations that obtain between the possibly sub-observable informational objects that constitute the system under investigation through the observable phenomenon. As you can see, this is quite a long technical definition, so I'm going to break it down, at least how I've interpreted it, to try to make sense of it from traditional way of thinking about realism and anti-realism. So if we take a look at the first part, I think this is really just trying to reflect the motivation of the no miracle argument here. He's just saying that our successful, when he talks about successful scientific theories, and he talks about success in terms of being able to provide explanations and perhaps being empirically adequate, and also having predictions. He outlines his view in terms of models, which adds another element of complexity to his view. And I don't think that really is going to matter too much to what I have to say. That's because he said himself he adopts the semantic or model theoretic view of theories. But as I say, I'll give you more of a picture on that in a moment, and we can see how the models fit in. But I think certainly when we take a look at this first sentence, we clearly see some attempt to connect his view to the no miracle argument, right? That there is some kind of motivation for having this view that depends on success, the success of scientific theories in some way, something that needs to be explained. And then we get this part at a given level of abstraction, which is very unique. And you don't find this in any form of structural realism, and that's because it forms part of Luciano Floridi's bigger philosophy and his project of level of abstractions. So what is a level of abstraction? According to him, he has introduced level of abstractions as a more intersubjective, socially constructible, and hence possibly conventional, dynamic, and flexible way to further Kant's approach. So levels of abstraction, therefore, are taken on a role similar to Kant's conceptual schemes. They are, in effect, taxonomies. They are ways in which we categorize and make sense of the world. And in a deep sense, they are not, in a sense, arbitrary. We have to access the world. We have to perceive the world through a level of abstraction. They existed before we have scientific theories, but since the scientific age, they have increasingly been part of scientific theories. They are socially constructed, but they are not innate in a way. They're not innate and they're not fixed in the way they are for Kant. They are, in fact, dynamic and they change. They have to, of course, be dynamic and change because science changes too and theories change. And so that's how they change. It should be worth noting that although it is quite similar, I think, to Kuhn's taxonomies and Kuhn's earlier paradigms, I think that he certainly doesn't seem to worry about issues like incommensurability. And he says explicitly, actually, in his paper that he does not think that levels of abstraction are untranslatable in any way. You can compare them, and you can think about their worth and their value in some kind of objective way. But how that pans out, I think, still remains to be seen. So just to kind of sum up that in a little bit more here, we have the theory on Floridi's view, which involves the level of abstraction and the model. And then we have phenomena, the word phenomena here being used in the Kantian sense of the things that we are directly aware of in our experience. And this is the physical system. He uses the word physical system for this as well. So those are the things that we are directly aware of. And the level of abstraction is a way we access it, and it's also in a way caused by or some way related to the physical system itself. This is just, again, the Kantian idea that what we experience is a combination of both the world in itself and the way in which we choose to describe it or engage with that world. Finally, we get this part at the end where, again, this seems to be like an attempt to kind of respond to the pessimistic meta-induction. So we get, in the best circumstances, our theories can be increasingly informative about the relations that obtain between the possibly sub-observable informational objects that constitute the system under investigation through the observable phenomena. Actually, the reference to sub-observable and observable here, I don't think is that important because everything is, in a sense, unobservable in the philosophy of science sense if it's beyond if it exists within the world in itself, and there are things in the world in itself which we can't perceive in the phenomena either. So I think that's not that important for none of what he says really rides on that distinction. What's more important is these two other references to information that he gives. So I'm just going to talk about those. The first use of information here is actually quite an ordinary, mundane use of information. For Floridi, information requires truth. If you're familiar with his account, he's quite idiosyncratic account of information requires truth. So I think in this first sentence, this sentence where he refers to information first, he's just talking about the truth or the knowledge that we can get about the world in itself. So that's kind of a standard point. I don't think we should worry about that too much. It's this second use of the word information, which I think needs a little bit of unpacking, informational objects. And we need to understand that for Floridi, informational objects here are the things in the world in itself that make possible our experiences, our perceptual experiences, in that sense, the phenomena. And for him, this amounts to something which are called relations of binary difference or binary difference relations, which I'm going to symbolize just with the R there like this. Let's take a look at his definitions then. So he says informational objects are clusters of data, but not in the alphanumeric sense of data, but then something he says which is equally common sense, which I actually don't think sounds very common sense, but which is the differences d'array. Differences d'array is mind-independent concrete points of lack of uniformity. He also gives another definition. In a simplest form, a datum can be reduced to just a lack of uniformity, that is a binary difference. So this is a rather interesting version of, I guess, what we might call digital metaphysics, although he's not thinking of it in like realist sense of everything being made up of zeros and ones. He's thinking of it in terms of relations. I guess this is why for him the world is ultimately at bottom structural. And then we have the relation to the epistemology here. The relation of difference seems a precondition for any relation and hence for any process of knowledge. Relata as merely differentiated entities are possible only because there is a relation of difference in the first place. And then he says, consider what a completely undifferentiable entity might be. It would be one that would be unobservable and unidentifiable at any possible level of abstraction. So putting this all together, I think we get something that looks like this. I'm sorry for this rather monstrous looking diagram. This is a development of the diagram that Floridi actually gives in his own work. But I just added a few things on it to bring out the realist component, the part of it that we're interested in as realists. So you can see here the theory involves primarily the level of abstraction, which is your taxonomy or your language, however you want to call it, your model that you use that to create, the system, the physical system which we experience, the phenomena is partly influences that. But from that model, we can extract a structure. And I'm assuming here, this will be something like relational claims or something that's wrapped up in the laws and equations of our theory. And then from that structure, we can make a philosophical abstraction. I put this outside the theory because clearly this is not something that scientists do. Perhaps this isn't even something that any philosopher is going to try to do, but it's supposed to be there, right? It's supposed to exist. So on the basis of that structure, we could extract some binary structure, some structure of relations of difference, that one thing does not equal another thing. And then that structure we should be all going to plan on safe grounds to infer about the mind-independent world. So we can know some kind of structure about the world in and of itself, outside of our levels of abstraction and outside of our theories. What I've given here is a kind of simplified version. I think this is accurate enough for the purposes that I want to use it for. It doesn't involve all the details, but I think it gives a more user-friendly definition. So successful scientific theories can be increasingly true about the informational structure of the world, where the informational structure is given by relations of binary difference. So I think that's a more simplified version of informational structural realism. Probably Floridi wouldn't say that was his version, but I'm looking at that one because I think that that's something we can kind of put into our head and get used to. Okay, so that's before I go on to see how well it works then with in terms of whether it can be supported by the no miracle argument or whether or not it can provide a response to the pessimistic meta-induction. I just want to talk about a couple of other assumptions that are sitting behind Floridi's view. And I think it would be important to bring these out because they can prove a bit problematic later on. So I already mentioned levels of abstraction, and these are socially constructed taxonomies of some kind, right? And these are the things that we use to presumably to create data. If we think about it in terms of phenomena and data, this is, although it's a weird kind of way of putting it here, but it nonetheless constitutes or is part of the world itself, or the world that we experience. So it's a little bit like Kuhn's paradigms in the sense that they determine actually partially how we experience or what we experience as well. So perception, particularly empirical observation, is always mediated by a level of abstraction, or at least in any cognitive sense or meaningful sense, right? Perhaps you could have raw experiences that have no levels of abstraction behind it, but presumably on that basis, you couldn't create memories, you couldn't create thoughts, you couldn't have propositions or anything that amounts to knowledge. So I guess that's why a level of abstraction is needed for any kind of belief or any kind of epistemic access to the world. And levels of abstraction are dynamic, so they change through theory change. So concepts of things that were once part of a level of abstraction, like phlogiston, caloric, vital force, these are abandoned by later theories and later levels of abstraction. But we can still talk about them meaningfully, and we can compare them on Floridi's view. There doesn't seem to be any issue about incommensurability. Okay, so I'm going to talk about now the correctness theory of truth. This is part of Floridi's philosophy that might not be so well known. And this is a way of developing, if we're to understand what he means by information, we need to understand what he means by truth, because for him, truth is an essential part of information. So for him, information is well-formed, meaningful, and true data. So not any data provides information. Any data that's false is misinformation, according to Floridi. This is his very strong semantic theory of information, where he's trying to interpret information in a way which is more akin to common sense. So it's quite different from those mathematical theories of information, which actually I think do have important philosophical insights as well. But he thinks that this one is more akin to common sense, and this is the one that he is focusing on. So Floridi rejects correspondence and other theories of truth that make truth a relation somehow between a proposition or a statement and some kind of mind-independent world, or any kind of model or anything in that way. For him, truth is not a correspondence relationship in that way. In fact, Floridi holds onto a pragmatic theory of truth, and really what does all the work here is whether or not something is correct. So he reduces truth to correctness, and he has a theory about what correctness accounts to. So it's a little bit complex, but for him, a proposition is true if it can be broken down into a question and answer form, and the answer is correct for that question. What does that amount to in principle? Well, this is his definition here. This is his definition, and you can see it's quite complicated, and I'm not actually going to read that out. There is a diagram as well that you can look at in more detail if you want to. And I think really to understand that diagram, you really need to read the paper in which he presents it. But fortunately for us, I think actually we don't need to go into that much detail. I'm going to give, just like I did before with Informational Structural Realism, I'm going to give a simplified version that I think gets to what we need to know about it. So on Floridi's correctness theory of truth, a proposition is true if and only if that proposition, first of all, can be turned or reduced into a question and an answer, where that answer is well-formed. So that just takes the well-formed part. And then secondly, that answer needs to help us construct a model of a physical system that allows an agent to access that physical system with respect to certain goals and purposes. So there's the pragmatic aspect of his theory of truth. Truth then, on Floridi's count, is almost like has three components. It has the physical system itself, the phenomenon. It has the model, or the propositions, and then it also has what you want to get from the physical system by using those propositions. At least this is how I've understood his theory of truth. And as he puts it, the model acts like a key to unlock the physical system. You need something to unlock that physical system to get the things that you want from it. Presumably this means, among other things, being able to make successful predictions, being able to manipulate the world for our own goals and purposes in a standard kind of pragmatic way. And so that's how those three things are supposed to relate to one another. Now, you might already think on this that clearly this is not going to work very well with any person who has realist intuitions, right? And he even says as much himself, which is quite interesting that this paper comes after his paper on structural realism. So he says here, the philosopher sharing some form of realism may be willing to accept the correctness theory of truth, but it's not one that he or any Kantian favors, because the alternative advocated by CTT points in the direction of a modest epistemology. Here, we never talk about the ultimate real nature of the world itself, but compare data sets, the model, to other data sets, the system, or putting it in the Kantian way, the phenomena, in the Kantian sense, to still other phenomena. Presumably the primary phenomena is the physical system that's partially constructed by the world in itself and partially by our conceptual schemes, and the other phenomena is our own models that we create to try to understand the physical system, or rather we use it for our own ends with the physical system. Right, so now I'm going to return to the no miracle argument and the pessimistic meta-induction to try to see how well Floridi's informational structural realism does at reconciling these two arguments. So in the standard version of the no miracle argument, how I understand it, realism is supposed to be inferred because truth is the best explanation of why theories are successful, why they're good at making predictions, and why they're so useful, why we can get technological advances and these kinds of things. However, here we notice there's a problem straight away when we compare this to Floridi's own theory, because truth can't really be appealed to do any explanation, at least on Floridi's version. This is because the correctness theory of truth is itself a pragmatic theory. In other words, by definition, a truth theory is one that is successful. For him, truth is a matter of being successful. So we can't give an explanation, or we can't use the no miracle argument as an inference to the best explanation if truth is defined partially already in terms of it being successful. That would be like trying to explain why our theories are successful by saying that they are successful. So I think we have a problem right off from the beginning there in trying to use the no miracle argument to support information structural realism in any kind of non-circular or non-vacuous way. Now, that doesn't mean that Floridi doesn't have any way to contact scientific theories with reality. Although he doesn't speculate on it too much in his paper on structural realism, he does give what looks like a kind of transcendental argument. If we go back to those quotes that I mentioned earlier, he says that the relations of difference seem to precondition for any other relation and hence for any process of knowledge. And also he says a world that was purely undifferentiable, in other words, one that didn't have his difference relations within them, wouldn't be one that could be known, wouldn't be one that could be observed or described at any level of abstraction. So this is just kind of the raw metaphysics that need to exist in order for there to be any kind of perception. And when I use the word metaphysics here, I mean the metaphysics of the mind-independent world. So can this give him that connection to reality that a realist would need in order to think that by believing in our scientific theories, we are actually knowing or coming to believe something about the world in itself? Well, I think there's a bit of a problem here as well. And, the argument from him goes that for it to be possible to know that two things, whatever they may be, are different, is just in case that there is a difference of relation between them in the mind-dependent world. But the problem with this is that we can't go from our current theories to thinking that we have got the correct structure of the world. For all we know, our existing theories may have completely the wrong structure. We can only go from our current theories to thinking that there is those differences that we postulate in our theories to the world if we have some other way to do that. To assume that we already know our theories, to assume that our theories are already true, and then to infer on that basis that there is a structure in the world would be just assuming what we're trying to prove. We'll be assuming that the structure is correct in our theories to infer that it is in the world. Now, what Floridi needs here then is obviously some kind of mechanism that guarantees that whatever level of abstraction we use, whatever thing we use to describe the world, is somehow going to be imprinted within it, the structure of the world itself. That's precisely what Russell tried to do with the different effect, different cause principle that he uses. But Floridi never actually adopts that principle. In fact, he doesn't adopt any metaphysical principle to try and guarantee that connection between those two. So I guess he could use some principle like that, but he doesn't. So whether that can be done or not with the kind of structure he has, I think remains to be seen. What about the pessimistic meta-induction? So can this offer the realist, can informational structural realism at least offer the realist some kind of defense or response or better response to the pessimistic meta-induction than, say, ordinary structural realism does? So we know that Floridi claims that subsequent theories in the history of science are increasingly informative about the world. But we have another interpretive issue here about what increasingly informative could mean. We know already that informative has to be true. So we have a bit of a question about where this truth is supposed to be coming from. Is this information about the mind-independent world, or is it information about the physical system that the scientists have direct perceptual awareness of, i.e., the phenomena? Well, we can just look at both of these, right, and see what the results are. The first option is to think that successive theories provide more information about a mind-independent world. But we know that for this, information requires truth. But here we have, again, a bit of a problem on Floridi's view, because truth is supposed to be a relation between the physical system, the model, and a set of pragmatic criteria. So it doesn't look like we can get truth in any kind of obvious way there. So how can they be informative about the world in itself remains a mystery. And as we've already seen, without something like the no miracle argument, or without something like Russell's same effect, different cause principle, we can't provide a way of making a connection between the world in itself and the structure in our existing scientific theories. So perhaps it looks like the best route to go here then is to say that successive theories are more informative about the physical system, and then we somehow find a way later of connecting the physical system to the world in itself. This option looks like it might be quite viable, especially if you take on board Floridi's view that there is no problem with comparing subsequent scientific theories in terms of incommensurability. But we know already that the physical system itself is partly constituted by the level of abstraction that's attached to the theory in question. So we know that the level of abstraction is going to change, or the levels of abstraction are going to change with new scientific theories. So they're not commensurable, and they can be compared and translated. But we do still have a problem here, because even if we take that on board, we're still going to get different structures in each case. That we know. You know, even if we get the structure which involves Fresnel's laws of light, and we compare that to Maxwell's equations, we still know that those are two different sets of laws and principles, at least as they are written down on paper. Because they refer to different things, they talk about different things. So we do still have two different structures there. Now, of course, what we want is to try and show that there is some structural continuity in some form between them, which in Floridi's view means that we need to show that there's somehow continuity of information. But here we have another problem, because information, as we've seen already, requires truth, and truth itself is partially constructed upon pragmatic criteria, which can change over time, but perhaps more worryingly, depend upon the theory in question, depend upon the model in question. So what that means is that there's no even in an abstract way, there's no objective measure of continuity between scientific theories. We can't say in a typical realist way that from an external position, that there is continuity of structure between successive scientific theories. We can only do it from the perspective of our existing scientific theory, right? Where we can say, yes, it has the information or not. And I think the worrying thing about this is that from the standpoint of our existing theories, we're going to have to say that everything in the past was not information, right? Did not provide information, because it turned out it is now judged to be false, or is no longer useful in the way in which we need it to be. So I think it also struggles to provide a reasonable or sensible response to the pessimistic meta-induction. All right, just before I close then and open it up to some questions, I want to give a brief sketch of an alternative way in which I think information could be useful for structural realists. And what I'm going to say is not entirely new. A lot of it has been said already. And so I'm going to really rely on what a lot of people have said. But I think connecting it to structural realism in this way can help alleviate some issues or some problems. So the concept of information that I think we should utilize is a well-known one, and it's one that comes with a lot of mathematical study and has been used in describing and talking about science for quite some time already. And this is the idea of thinking of information as the shortest possible description of an object that we get from algorithmic information theory. And the concept of information that we get from here has been made very precise. We can define it clearly as the length of the shortest program on a universal Turing machine that correctly characterizes some amount of data. The relationship to science was spotted even by the early developers of this theory of information, Solomonov, Kolmogorov, and Gregory Chaitin. And all of them noticed a connection between thinking of information in this way and the scientific process. And you can see in their work, they quite clearly think of science as an attempt to provide algorithms that compress empirical data. You know, they see science as a data problem, or they see knowledge as a data problem. The world, the universe is a source of information, and we are bombarded with huge amounts of data, huge amounts of which carry information about the world around us. And the job of scientists is to try to find some way of compressing that. And the best way to do that is to look for what Dennett calls real patterns, right? There are these patterns among that data. And whenever there are patterns, we can find a shorter way or a more compressed way of describing that data or capturing that data or that information. And as I said already, you know, this way of thinking about the connection between algorithmic information theory and science has been noticed before many times, and has even been discussed in connection with realism through the work of Ladyman, French, and Collier in their rainforest realism, which I think is addressing a slightly different issue about reductionism and levels, but nonetheless you can see that there is a way of being realist that relates to algorithmic information theory. But what I want to claim here is that if we use this concept of information, we can actually provide an information-based framework for structural realism, or alternative to the informational structural realism Floridi gives, that is able to overcome some of these difficulties that you find in his view. And the basic idea here is going to be that the algorithms of our scientific theories are those parts given by its laws and equations, and these can provide effective algorithmic compressions of data that we receive through our experience with the world or interacting with the world. And there is preservation. There is preservation of these algorithms through scientific change. And that counts as a kind of preservation of structure. So if we want to talk about the structure of the world, we want to talk about what it is that we know. Structure of the world is that part of the world that we can capture and express through algorithms, through our laws and equations. Trying to give a definition then, this is a very, very rough sketch. Read that as probably being flawed and in need of a lot of revisions. We have algorithmic structural realism, which is another version of informational structural realism, which simply says that successful scientific theories provide programs that can be run on a universal Turing machine whose output is increasingly structurally isomorphic to the real world. Or if you prefer to have it in terms of just individual data, like digital bit string, for example, you might want to rewrite this in terms of Dennett's real patterns. You might say, in the output of this universal Turing machine, you get patterns that are similar or resemble the patterns within the world itself, or something along those lines. So let's go back to the numerical argument and the pessimistic meta-induction then, just to see whether this new informational structuralism can do a better job. Well, first of all, we don't need to sign up to Floridi's own theory of information or his theory of truth. And I think that already gives us a lot more freedom here, in a sense. In terms of the actual way you relate this view to existing epistemologies, like empiricism or Kantianism, I think is up to, there are many different options here. In its simplest sense, we can just think of the world as a sort of source of information. This is already a realist metaphysics of some kind, and science or scientists are always encoding that information into data of some kind or another. And we use that data to build models and make predictions and so on and so forth. And here we can use the no miracle argument to support this view, because we can say something along the lines of, we wouldn't be very good at compressing that data if in fact the algorithms for that compression did not represent real patterns in the world in some form or another, right? In other words, that we have correctly got information about the world at that level, at the structural level. Now, we can't infer to knowing everything about the world. We can't infer to having all information about the world, because there's a great deal in our scientific theories that is not algorithmic. There are those parts of the data which are random. There is the language itself that we use to construct it and the metaphysical assumptions behind that. So there's a lot going on elsewhere in our theory that is, in a sense, not preserved in theory change. And it's that part, I think, that traditionally the structural realist would say is the part that we should be agnostic about, or even positively think does not or cannot represent reality in any meaningful way. In terms of the pessimistic meta-induction, then, we just need to say, in theory, we just need to say that throughout theoretical change, there is a retention of algorithms that we use to compress empirical data. And those algorithms are wrapped up in the laws and equations. But there is a bit of a problem, because we know that there is language change between successive theories. And we don't want to be in the same problem that Floridi was in not being able to demonstrate that there is, in any sense, structural preservation between, or algorithmic continuity. One way in which algorithmic information theory is an improvement, I think, on Floridi's view, is that we can appeal to the invariance theorem, which is a well-known foundational result within algorithmic information theory, to help us resolve that problem. So the invariance theorem pretty much just states that if we want to talk about the best possible description, or the shortest possible description of some data, such a claim is always going to be relative to the language or to the computing machinery that we use to try and produce it in some form or another. So there is a kind of language dependency always on this kind of statement. But the invariance theorem states that no matter what language we use, or no matter what computer or machine we use to try to output a given bit of data or a given string of data, it will always be, the shortest possible description will always be bounded or limited to a constant number. And that constant number is just the length of an additional program that we could use to translate from one language to the other. And the philosophical significance of the invariance theorem by many is believed to be that it shows that Kolmogorov complexity, or algorithmic complexity, or the shortest possible description, captures something which is objective or intrinsic within objects themselves. So no matter what language you use to describe it, if you have found the shortest possible description, there is some similarity between all of those shortest possible descriptions. There is something that they all have in common in some way or another. And of course, the structural realist would say that it's the algorithms that they have in common, right? There is some common structure in the algorithms. Now, the invariance theorem then can be used to help us track, at least in abstract terms. Again, we put aside the question of whether we know we have got continuity or not, but at least in abstract terms, we can at least make sense of what it means for theories to preserve algorithms across theory change as well as progress. In terms of continuity, we know that there is continuity between successive theories as long as we're able to use later theories, or the algorithms from later theories, to compress the same data that was used to produce the algorithms in the first theory. In other words, putting it more simply, we could, if we wanted to, use our later laws and equations to describe or compress the data from earlier theories that we used to produce earlier theories. I guess to use a kind of Worrell's example here, you can use Maxwell's equations to successfully make predictions and to compress the data that Fresnel used to come up with his own laws of light. And the idea here is that we can do that because we just translate the data from one language to another. Scientific progress, in principle, is possible whenever we get better compressions, right? The goal of science is to provide better compressions of the world, is to try to find the best compression of the world in a given language, in our own language. Now, what that means is that in theory, a later theory provides a better compression than an earlier theory, as long as the length of the algorithms in that theory is less than or shorter than the algorithms in the first theory. Now, the difference needs to be significant enough that it overcomes any difference that's due just to one's choice of language. And this is why we say that the length must be less, plus the addition of the length of any translation program that we could use to merely just turn the data from one form into the other. We want to make sure that the gains that we may seem to get is really a result of us getting a better algorithm, us getting a better, more concise description of the world, rather than just choosing a different language, right? Rather than just finding a language which produces a shorter description. So that allows us to guarantee, or rather that, at least in theory or in principle, allows us to demonstrate progress, or at least the progress is possible on this view. So just summarize then, how realist is informational structural realism? I don't think it's very realist at all. But at least with regards to the no miracle argument and the pessimistic meta-induction, but I do think a more realist version of structural realism is possible if informational structural realism is possible if we move to thinking about information in terms of algorithmic information theory. So thank you very much.